Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, how's it going, everybody? It is Monday, September 30th, 2019. Time for yet another show, and we're not doing this one live. Can you believe it? Happy New Year, everyone. It's Rosh Hashanah. Time for me to be away from the microphone, but we did prepare this pre-recorded show for you over the weekend, including some of the developments that actually happened over the weekend. But as pretty much as expected, the weekend was a wild and woolly one, including, well, all sorts of good things like, the president accusing Adam Schiff of treason and insisting that he be questioned at the highest levels, whatever that's supposed to mean. And word comes to us by way of 60 Minutes Sunday evening that the whistleblower who filed the whistleblower report, of course, regarding the Ukraine situation, is in federal witness protection, essentially. Who they're protecting this whistleblower from exactly is unclear, but it poses a lot of disturbing questions. Of course, it could be fanatical supporters of Trump's who might pose a threat. Could be Trump himself, for that matter, who poses a threat. And, the world waits on the edge of its seat to find out whether Donald Trump believes that he can, let's say, maybe he can order the Attorney General to give him the information on the protective detail and where they're staying. And I don't know exactly what kind of answer William Barr gives to that. He may, I assume, at some point begs him, please don't make me give you that information. It'll just be a world of trouble for you, but I don't know that that necessarily means he doesn't give him the information. What could I do? The president ordered me. After that, I gave him the information. I fulfilled my duty. After that, what he does is his business. I really don't know how I would bet Barr reacts to that. But anyway, we do have we do have this pre-recorded show for you. We'll be back on Tuesday, and we'll have all sorts of bonus shows this week and try and squeeze extra shows that is out of Greg Dworkin and pull him off of his usual Monday, Wednesday, Thursday schedule, because I'll be off the air again on Wednesday. I know it's terrible timing, but there's really not much that can be done about it, unfortunately. And, it'll happen all over again in 10 days or so as Yom Kippur rolls around as well. So don't get too upset about it. We have a good show for you today that will bring you up to date. And honestly, I think the show would largely be the same today because this is essential information that just has to be a part of an ordered presentation, as though that was what I was putting together. An ordered presentation on what the hell is happening with Donald Trump now that impeachment is on the table. So, all right, we've gathered up a bunch of great stories, a couple of them that I teased at the end of last week. And we'll be back, as I said, tomorrow with a live show to make sure that you stay up to date there. I will try and see if we can prepare something for Wednesday. That's a little bit more difficult, but we won't leave you hanging. And boy, the exciting conclusion of this week should be explosive and spectacular. And I'm hoping that it's not literally explosive. Okay, ready to roll? Here we go. Okay, so I left you over the weekend, just before we closed out the show on Friday, with the teaser from Tim Mack, who has written a piece for NPR that was no doubt discussed by many of you over the weekend, that revealed the existence of the release of a Senate report that names the NRA, the National Rifle Association, as a foreign asset to Russia ahead of the 2016 elections. So let's take a look at that report, read through it, and see what else we might pick up from it. The National Rifle Association acted as a foreign asset for Russia in the period leading up to the 2016 election, according to a new investigation unveiled Friday by Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon. Drawing on contemporaneous emails and private interviews, an 18-month probe by the Senate Finance Committee's Democratic staff found that the NRA underwrote political access for Russian nationals Maria Butina, as we may have decided on pronouncing things, and Alexander Torshin, more than previously known, even though the two had declared their ties to the Kremlin. The report, which is available, linked through the article itself, also describes how closely the gun rights group was involved with organizing a 2015 visit by some of its leaders to Moscow. Then NRA Vice President Pete Brownell, who would later become NRA president, was enticed to visit Russia with the promise of personal business opportunities. Who could have guessed that? And the NRA covered a portion of the trip's costs. The conclusions of the Senate investigation could have legal implications for the NRA, Wyden says. Tax-exempt organizations are barred from using funds for the personal benefit of its officials or for actions significantly outside their stated missions. The revelations in the Senate report raise questions about whether the NRA could face civil penalties or lose its tax-exempt status. Attorneys general in the state of New York and in the District of Columbia are conducting separate probes into alleged wrongdoing at the gun rights organization. These probes have a broader scope than the Senate report, which focuses on Russia, since we're talking about narrow scopes and Russia investigations. Now, there's a bit more down here, the majority response. And again, I guess here we'll pause to remind you, this is a Democratic Senate committee staff report, which makes it, of course, a minority report of some kind. I guess following, it wasn't clear to me whether the full committee had held any sort of investigative probes into this or whether it was simply something that minority staff took on. But there is a majority response, which might help clear things up. And I guess here again, we'll just add, as minority views, it doesn't actually do anything. It may later serve as the basis for a majority report if Democrats are able to capture the Senate. And likewise, it may form the basis of federal investigation of some sort, or I guess if he's still lingering in office, yet another possible avenue for impeachment investigation of Trump. But for the moment, they've done a great job, I guess I'll say, in publicizing this and generating a lot of excitement about it, even though all it is a minority report that doesn't go anywhere. Anyway, here's the majority response. They, of course, think this whole thing is overblown. And the Republican majority on the Senate Finance Committee, which was consulted periodically throughout the Democrats' investigation, said Friday that the report was overblown. They probably should have said it's just a bunch of Democrats getting together and writing something. It's not even an action of the committee. Unfortunately, that's the truth of it. In the Republicans' analysis of Wyden's report, the majority argued that it does not account for U.S.-Russia relations at the time and contains much conclusory innuendo and repeatedly attempts to paint a picture that does not exist. The Republicans also argued that if the NRA committed any infractions, they would be small and do not put the NRA's tax-exempt status at risk. To the extent NRA funds were used improperly and any facts discussed in the Democratic report led by Wyden, this document, it appears to have been minor, hardly a rounding error for an organization with hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue each year, and nothing that cannot be corrected with minor intermediate sanctions, the Republican analysis states. Wyden's 77-page report centers on Butina, a convicted Russian agent now in federal prison, and Torshin, a former Russian government official who has been sanctioned by the United States. The report indicates that top NRA officials were aware of Butina's and Torshin's links with the Kremlin, even as they sought to work more closely together under the banner of gun rights. In an email circulated later to two senior NRA staff members, Butina wrote that a purpose of the 2015 Moscow trip was that, quote, many powerful figures in the Kremlin are counting on Torshin to prove his American connections, unquote. by showing he could bring prominent NRA officials to Russia. That's actually spilling quite a few beans there. At another point, Butina suggested to participants on the 2015 NRA trip that she might be able to set up a meeting between them and President Vladimir Putin, referring to him as Russia's highest leader. Well, he is that. But really, that's so strange that an email circulated to two senior NRA staff members says basically, oh, you'll be brought to Moscow to prove to the Kremlin that Torshin has clout and you're the bait. Why would you cooperate in that? Moving on here, despite these declarations about their ties to the Russian government, NRA officials paid for and facilitated Torshin and Butina's introduction into American political organizations. Butina and Torshin received access to Republican Party officials at NRA events. It was an explicit interest expressed by Butina. In one 2015 email to an NRA employee, Butina wrote, quote, "Is there a list of U.S. governors or members of Congress that might be present at some time during the NRA annual meeting?" The employee responded with a list. The NRA also helped them forge connections with groups such as the Council for National Policy, the National Prayer Breakfast, the National Sporting Goods Wholesalers Association, and the Safari Club International. Very interesting. But by the way, in hindsight, this is a Russian spy asking the NRA, can you please give us a list of members of Congress or U.S. governors who will be at your event so that they can be targeted by Russian intelligence? And the NRA said, why, sure, here's a list. Have at it. NRA resources appear to have been used to pay for membership and registration fees to third-party events for Torshin and Butina. Interesting. As well as to arrange for transit to and lodging for many of those events throughout 2015 and 2016, the report states. The Senate report notes that in 2018, then NRA spokeswoman Dana Loesch repeatedly denied that the group's leader's 2015 trip to Moscow was sanctioned by the gun rights group. That apparently now a lie, so let that be another episode of how to read a Trumpster comment, basically. But in a letter obtained by the committee, then NRA President Alan Kors wrote to Torshin on NRA letterhead after consulting with NRA staff and former NRA President David Keene. Kors designated two NRA figures to lead the trip. Dave Keene and top NRA donor Joe Gregory will represent the NRA and our 5 million members better than anyone else, he wrote. During the course of the investigation, Brownell's lawyer also told the committee that Brownell believed the trip was an NRA official event. This view is further strengthened by the committee's evidence that NRA staff prepared itineraries, gathered briefing materials, applied for tourist visas, paid for some of the travel expenses, and provided the delegation with NRA gifts to give to Russian officials. We're going on a spy mission. Will you book our flights? Sure. Wow. The Senate investigation also found evidence that the NRA tried to hide various payments related to the trip. Brownell covered approximately $21,000 in expenses related to the trip. In June 2016, the NRA reimbursed Brownell just over $21,000. After questions were raised about that trip in 2018, Brownell paid the NRA $17,000. A transaction that Brownell's lawyer told the committee was requested by the NRA as a way of getting the trip off the NRA's books. A couple more beans spilled there. The Senate investigation, you could have just said, well, after further review, they decided that it wasn't, the trip didn't really comport entirely with the stated mission of the NRA as an organization, and they decided upon review to disallow the reimbursement, so he paid them back, or at least partially disallow the reimbursement. But instead, they just blurted it out. It's a way of getting the trip off the NRA's books. Okay, I'll take it. The Senate investigation concludes that a number of NRA figures on the 2015 trip traveled to Russia primarily or solely for the purpose of advancing personal business interests rather than advancing the NRA's tax-exempt purpose. Brownell, then a vice president of the NRA, is CEO of a major firearms supplier bearing his last name. Yes, okay, we recognize it. In an email to a staffer at his business, Brownell describes his trip as an opportunity to be hosted in Russia to broaden our business opportunities, to introduce our company to the governing individuals throughout Russia, to sell their guns, I guess, in Russia. Now, it occurs to me that probably gun enthusiasts recognize the last name. I don't know whether they pronounce it the way I do or not. I've never bought one of their guns or talked to anybody who has, so I'm not familiar. The NRA directly facilitated Brownell's effort to travel to Moscow early to explore business opportunities with Russian weapons manufacturers, the report concludes. I guess they were at this point confused about why it would be improper because, everybody at the NRA knows what their real business model is. They're a trade association for gun manufacturers. So they were temporarily baffled, temporarily lost their senses, and forgot that their tax-exempt status depends on there being an individual membership-based gun safety advocacy organization, which they haven't been for a long time. Another member of the trip, NRA donor and then Outdoor Channel CEO Jim Liberatore, I'm not sure how he pronounces that, Liberator with an E on the end, Liberatore, told the Senate committee through his lawyer that his participation in the Moscow trip was purely commercial. Well, okay. Wyden, the top Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee, said at the conclusion of his investigation that his staff had revealed information that shows that the National Rifle Association may have abused its tax-exempt status. The next step, he says, is for the IRS to launch its own inquiry. We'll see how far that goes and how independent the IRS is, I guess. The totality of evidence uncovered during my investigation, as well as the mounting evidence of rampant self-dealing, indicate the NRA may have violated tax laws, Wyden said. The IRS needs to examine these findings and investigate other publicly reported incidents of potential lawbreaking. Very interesting. I imagine we would have to review the report itself to glean from it where the foreign asset terminology comes from. And that is enclosed in quotes in the article, but the article doesn't make clear exactly where that came from. So we'll see whether this gains any traction. But I was hoping that it would, because I thought that it might be an effective end to the talking point Republicans have been circulating in the wake of the Ukraine whistleblower investigation, claiming that Democrats' impeachment mania was going to make it impossible from this point forward to legislate in the Senate or in the House or elsewhere on any number of topics, but including they thought it would be a real sore point if they held out the idea that, we were this close to coming to some sort of agreement on guns following the outrageous spate of mass shootings that we've all been suffering from and living under that cloud. Nobody really thought that the Republicans were ever going to come around on this stuff, although, you hold out hope that one day they'll finally become too embarrassed to continue. But I guess the idea that they were this close to moving ahead with significant gun legislation, and now that's out the window because you Democrats are being so partisan in trying to impeach Donald Trump, well, we just can't go forward with it. Well, if it's really the case that the NRA was nothing more than a foreign asset for Russia during the 2016 election, that makes it a little more of a sticky wicket, I guess, if I'm using the terminology correctly here. But if you're going to say, because impeachment, we are going to kill off this gun legislation, well, isn't it really the fact that you're killing off gun legislation because this impeachment process will lead us to a much clearer picture of exactly what kind of role gun nuts and the NRA played in the very election rigging that we've been investigating in this impeachment investigation all along? Yeah, I think so. But who knows? Too much maybe too much nuance. Things have to be a little simpler. If anything, if we're supposed to learn anything from the Ukraine whistleblower incident, it's that things need to be quickly explainable in a sentence or less. Our attention spans are growing shorter and shorter every day. Here is another story, hopefully still operative, assuming that Donald Trump hasn't fled the country or resigned or what have you over the weekend. Reminder from Arthur Delaney at HuffPost, Donald Trump actually has 2 whistleblowers to worry about. Well, to make a long story short, the subheader tells us a little something about it. Don't worry, don't forget the whistleblower alleging possible interference with the IRS audit of the president's tax returns, if that's a real thing. An intelligence community whistleblower, he says, has stunned Washington with possible evidence that Donald Trump perverted, and that's a good word for it, U.S. foreign policy for his own personal gain. But there's another whistleblower, one with possible evidence that Trump tried to corrupt an Internal Revenue Service audit of his personal tax returns, who has received relatively little attention. And we love whistleblowers. They do tend to blow up known stories into, renewed and hot ones. So we should give this one a try. The tale of 2 whistleblowers reflects the Democrats' differing strategies as well as the whistleblower's own approaches. The intelligence whistleblower brought the complaint to the Intelligence Community Inspector General, who told Congress about the report but didn't hand it over because of objections from the White House. Adam Schiff, chair of the House Intelligence Committee, immediately brought the case to wide attention. The tax whistleblower, however, went straight to Congress, specifically to the House Ways and Means Committee, which had sued the Trump administration for refusing to provide copies of the president's tax returns in response to a formal request. Democrats say they need Trump's returns to make sure the IRS properly enforces tax laws against the president. But Ways and Means Chair Richard Neal is far less outspoken than Schiff, to say the least, I guess, and his approach to the tax case has been cautious. He decided to stay focused on the lawsuit, using the whistleblower's material to bolster that case. In a brief last month, the committee told the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia that a federal employee had approached them with evidence of possible misconduct and inappropriate efforts to influence an IRS audit of the president. The document provided no further detail about the whistleblower, but in a footnote, Democrats offered to tell U.S. District Judge Trevor McFadden all about it in private. One wonders whether they may have made a mistake in that. A spokesperson for the committee said this week that McFadden, a Trump nominee who donated to the Trump 2016 campaign and volunteered in the Trump presidential transition, has so far not asked to hear more about the whistleblower. What a surprise. He denied a Democratic motion to speed up the case. Neal declined to discuss the whistleblower this week, citing guidance from House lawyers. Other Ways and Means members who said they closely follow the tax returns issue have said they don't know anything about the person. I think that Chairman Neal has appropriately kept that very close, since that person's job could be in serious jeopardy. Representative Lloyd Doggett of Texas told HuffPost, the tax returns issue has dogged Trump since he refused to release his returns during the 2016 campaign, and now it could wind up as part of an impeachment proceeding. Although I guess it increasingly looks like it won't be, at least in the first salvo, and no one knows whether there will be any further ones anyway. Democrats moved toward impeachment last week really, largely as a result of information related to the intelligence whistleblower's complaint, which is still secret, or at least it was. We'll have to correct the record here. Was secret, although, it was secret when this was written. It was then released, I think, in redacted form, so maybe you could still say it's still secret. You might be able to hang your hat on that. Ever since Congress caught President Richard Nixon underpaying his taxes in the 1970s, the IRS has followed a policy of automatically auditing the president and vice president every year. Trump is the first president since Nixon not to voluntarily disclose his tax returns, which detail income, charitable donations, and taxes paid to the public. The New York Times has reported that in the past he fraudulently avoided paying taxes. In a court brief last week, Ways and Means Democrats repeated that they had evidence from a whistleblower, which they said suggested the regular IRS audit may not be functioning effectively, in part because of the absence of safeguards to protect IRS employees and the audit process from improper influence. So I guess what that is hinting at is that Trump has already found out which IRS employees have got those returns and are conducting that audit, and has, I guess, either spoken to them or passed a message to them. I don't know what the contents of the message could have been. The White House has declined to comment on the tax matter. Republicans in Congress have said they don't know anything about it. In her Tuesday announcement that the House was officially investigating whether to impeach the president, Speaker Nancy Pelosi said the oversight committees, which include Ways and Means, would submit evidence to the Judiciary Committee as it drafts articles of impeachment. Don't know if that's still operative. Jeff Hauser, director of the Revolving Door Project, an anti-corruption advocacy group, said the overall impeachment case would be stronger if Democrats could show that the Ukrainian shakedown wasn't an isolated case. The House Ways and Means Committee must figure out a way to make the public aware of the serious cause to worry that the IRS might have been corrupted by Trump, Hauser said. And good point, and well worth consideration. You have to give some serious consideration to whether or not the outcome of the impeachment case is stronger or not, based on being able to point to the same sort of behavior being used even in other cases. But I think everybody kind of knows that. And luckily, I guess, well, on the one hand, the jury being the United States Senate, that's a little unlucky because they're not going to vote based on the evidence so much as based on their political affiliation. But on the other hand, you can also be pretty sure that the jurors know very well that there are a number of issues surrounding the president, and they don't have to be introduced like formal evidence in a courtroom. All right. Interesting, worth keeping an eye on to see whether there's any more developments there, and worth adding to the file on Richard Neal if this thing doesn't work out. Time now for some long form, let's say a long form chewing up of our 2-hour block. An article I mentioned last week and that I still think is relevant and interesting. Ryan Grimm's piece in The Intercept, Why the House Democratic Caucus Was Able to Move So Rapidly Toward Impeachment. Let's look into that. I think it was a pretty good explainer for things. I think I found myself in general agreement with it. The piece begins on Wednesday, September 18th, as Democrats prepped for a series of private meetings. It was clear that nerves had been frayed. August had been a challenge for the party's rank and file as activists and angry citizens back home browbeat them at town halls, grocery stores, and local events for the party's unwillingness to impeach President Donald Trump. We spent all summer getting the S word, kicked out of us back home, said one Democrat who received such treatment. The day before, former Trump advisor Corey Lewandowski had made a mockery of the Judiciary Committee's interview of him, betraying open contempt for the process and the people running it. Swing district freshman Democrats, known as frontliners, meanwhile, had spent the last few weeks vocally decrying the pressure on them to call for impeachment, claiming it was putting them in a political jam. Democrats were debating publicly whether the hearings Jerry Nadler was running at his Judiciary Committee were or were not, in fact, the launch of impeachment proceedings. Standing athwart the tide of impeachment, yelling stop, was House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. It wasn't her fault that the process had become a fiasco, Pelosi told her colleagues in one meeting. In her opinion, Nadler should have held Lewandowski in contempt, quote, right then and there. Well, that would have been fantastic. Did he know he had the authority to do that? But there was a bigger problem. Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland told his colleagues that day. Raskin, the highest-ranking progressive on the periphery of leadership, interesting way of designating him, is a constitutional attorney and had long been calling for impeachment on principle. But politics mattered now, too, he argued, and the party's passivity was causing real political pain for the rank-and-file members of Congress, particularly those holding back support of impeachment to honor the party leadership's opposition to it. In order to placate a small handful of frontliners, perhaps as few as 7 or 8, the entire party was being dragged down and routinely humiliated by Trump's contempt for the rule of law. That grassroots anger was translating into primary challenges, he noted, and needlessly furious constituents. Representative Sherry Bustos, the chair of the DCCC, and a champion of doing nothing when it came to Trump. She may dispute that, but okay. Anyway, she had recently counted as many as 111 primaries, far more than a typical cycle. The members without official primary challenges were by no means safe, as they might soon draw a challenge, unless the trajectory of the politics changed. Freshman Representative Lori Trahan from Massachusetts, for instance, came out for impeachment after Dan Coe, whom she beat in a primary by 147 votes in 2018, called on her to do so, with the clear threat that he may run again. The seats of upward of 200 Democrats were being put at risk to protect a handful of loud frontliners, Raskin argued, and it wasn't obvious that the strategy was actually protecting them from anything. Grassroots activists were demobilizing, Democrats across the board were facing primary challenges, and somehow, some way, Democrats seemed to be losing again to Trump. Something had to give. Don't know what the basis, by the way, for saying that grassroots activists were demobilizing. I think everybody was guessing that might be the case or might later become the case. I don't know if there's any data to back it up. I mean, it's a good guess. It's a little conclusory here, but there's the grain of salt. You can take it with that. That something, I guess, that had to give came later that night in the form of a Washington Post scoop about a whistleblower complaint from a member of the U.S. intelligence community about a promise Trump had made to a foreign leader. Then, on Thursday evening, the Post reported that the country involved was Ukraine. From there, it didn't take long to piece together what happened, capped off with confessions from both Trump and his attorney, Rudy Giuliani, the bagman for the operation. Trump had demanded that in exchange for U.S. aid, the new Ukrainian president investigate links between then Vice President Joe Biden, his son Hunter, and a scandal that involves the firing of a prosecutor and a natural gas company on whose board Hunter was paid handsomely to sit. They couldn't resist that dig over The Intercept. The affair itself, it's not unfair, right? The affair itself is not what it appears. By getting the prosecutor fired, Biden probably hurt Hunter's company more than anything, but it looks bad enough. Indeed, Hunter Biden had no skills to offer the natural gas company other than his appearance of an ability to influence his father, whether he did so or not. Trump clearly saw leveraging it as to his advantage in the 2020 election. The news had landed like a bomb in a Democratic caucus that was already ready to explode. Calls to impeach Trump rained down from the party's left flank and its presidential candidates. On Friday evening, Democrats were bracing for a backlash back home. It's going to be a brutal weekend for a lot of people, especially those who haven't spoken for impeachment, one Democrat predicted. Indeed, it was. Democrats, including frontliners, spent the weekend furiously texting and calling each other as they worked through how to respond to Trump's latest lawlessness. People are pissed, said another Democrat over the weekend. Frontliners are pissed. And not even the progressive frontliners either. Pelosi didn't seem to understand the shift that was taking place under her feet. Reporter John Harwood asked an aide to Pelosi over the weekend if the news changed her calculus on impeachment and got back the reply, no. See any GOP votes for it? I remember seeing that one. Jon Favreau, a speechwriter for President Barack Obama, who now serves from his perch at Pod Save America as something of a tribune for the volunteer resistance army that phone-banked and door-knocked Democrats into the majority, was apoplectic. This is insane, he said. This is pathetic. This is not what we worked so hard for in 2018. I guess that's the basis of the demobilization comment. Still, we don't know. By Tuesday afternoon, Pelosi was calling for impeachment proceedings to begin. We all remember how that went down. For much of the ongoing congressional session, there has been a fairly clear consensus inside the House Democratic Caucus as to where their most nettlesome political problems were likely to spring from. The radicals in the so-called squad, with their millions of Twitter followers and their magazine cover shoots, were going to become the face of the party, and swing voters across the country would recoil, costing frontliners their seats and sending the House and perhaps the White House back into GOP hands. For the first half of the year, Democratic leaders engaged in public battles with the squad. Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, and Rashida Tlaib played out via official condemnations on the House floor or in interviews with the New York Times columnist Maureen Dowd. Of the 44 frontliners in the Democratic caucus, the ones who'd been the most vocal against impeachment internally and in public included Max Rose, Elissa Slotkin, Abigail Spanberger, I wish I had a little bell sound effect for that one, Josh Gottheimer, Elaine Luria, Mikey Sherrill, Jared Golden, Chrissy Houlihan, and Jimmy Panetta, joined by others depending on the day. Collectively, the frontliners are crucial to the majority, so rank-and-file party members have long been willing to cut them extreme amounts of slack when it comes to moderating the Democratic agenda. But the Democrats most vocally opposed to impeachment, those who insisted not just on opposing it themselves, but worked to stop the broader caucus from moving forward, had begun to wear out their welcome, particularly as rank-and-file members compared them to the majority of frontliners who were not regularly griping publicly and privately about how much pressure they're under. Patience also wore thin as the politics of passivity no longer seemed to be benefiting even frontliners, as the demobilization of the Democratic base began to look like an existential electoral concern. And the arguments some frontliners were making on behalf of doing nothing had gotten increasingly strained. It's not hard at all to demand impeachment, one argued to colleagues. What actually takes courage is not demanding impeachment. The same frontliners who had been the most vocal against pursuing impeachment had also generally been the ones most hostile publicly and internally toward the squad. As more of the caucus began to see passivity rather than radicalism as the party's bigger problem, the caucus moved away from the idea that the squad was going to be their death knell, and even some frontliners grew less patient with internal attacks on them. Representative Angie Craig, a freshman frontliner from Minnesota, made the case privately to her frontline colleagues that if they have a problem with the squad or anybody else, they should feel free to say so publicly back home and use the contrast to set themselves apart. But, she argued at a private meeting just before the August recess, members should stop battling internally to have the squad shut down. Each member, she argued, has a district to represent, and that's the case too with Ocasio-Cortez, Omar, Tlaib, and Pressley. Good point. It's about time. On Monday, Craig came out in support of impeachment proceedings. She was joined by her Minnesota colleague Dean Phillips, another frontliner who made headlines earlier this year for his public break with Omar, who serves in a neighboring district. Trump has argued that by making the squad the face of the Democrats, he'll be able to win Minnesota in 2020, giving extra weight to the moves by Craig and Phillips, both of whom flipped GOP districts in 2018. Then, Monday night, 6 of the most vocal opponents of impeachment, the type Raskin was referring to at last week's, 2 weeks ago, meeting, published a joint op-ed in the Washington Post calling for impeachment proceedings to begin. The authors, all frontline freshmen, included Spanberger, Slotkin, Gil Cisneros of California, Houlihan, Luria, and Sherrill. Jason Crow of Colorado also signed, but he had previously come out in support of impeachment. They would be followed Tuesday by more frontliners advancing impeachment, including New York Representatives Antonio Delgado and Tom Suozzi. And they were followed by Pelosi, who called a meeting Tuesday afternoon to tell members she was moving forward with impeachment, though she hadn't decided if there would be a special committee formed or if it would go through a regular process. Representative Jerry Connolly, a Democrat from Virginia, left the meeting calling it both significant and anticlimactic. He had called for impeachment in August. In recent months, Democratic leaders deploying polling paid for by the DCCC have rained data down on House Democrats, repeatedly making the case that voters don't care about impeachment one way or the other, that it is unpopular in swing districts, and that the election will be decided next November by the state of the economy. The DCCC has argued, showing slides that members aren't allowed to take with them out of briefings, that voters want to see Democrats flex an affirmative agenda, not spend their time taking down Trump. Yet, even before Democrats launched an impeachment inquiry on Tuesday, media coverage was dominated by talk of impeachment anyway, and members were being confronted by angry constituents in their home districts. The most ambitious project launched by House Democratic leadership in 2019, its prescription drug package, was meanwhile released last week with barely a whimper. The polling pales in comparison to the scale of Trump's Ukraine gambit. This is extortion of a foreign leader. This is abuse of office in the most sordid way to get dirt on a prospective political opponent, Connolly said, calling it beyond the pale. Even if polls say that majorities in swing districts would prefer Democrats legislate and cooperate rather than focus on impeachment, those numbers don't tell the whole story. First, they ignore intensity. As the most active Democrats, the ones who show up to town halls and knock on doors, are also the most likely to be supportive of impeachment, and winning them over has major re-election advantages, while angering them comes with downsides. A senior aide to one frontline Democrat who came out for impeachment earlier in the summer said that doing so had minimized the pain that so many others felt over recess. August would have been really painful if we hadn't done it, the aide said. The surface-level polling also doesn't answer the question of what the consequences of impeachment would be. A commonly held reservation among Democrats who are wary of impeachment comes down to its political implication. Would impeaching Trump simply help re-elect him by galvanizing his supporters? And since the Senate will acquit him, why bother? That concern, argue impeachment supporters, misunderstands the way impeachment would be perceived publicly, and perhaps, more importantly, how failing to impeach appears to voters. All of the Democrats' talk about scandal and corruption, absent impeachment, seems like mere partisan bickering, whereas taking concrete action sends a signal to voters that there's more to it. Democrats' inability to control the message, had Nadler launched in an impeachment inquiry or not, had also put frontliners in a difficult spot. In late August, Spanberger vented about that on a frontliner conference call. She asked if anybody could tell her if Democrats had or had not launched an impeachment inquiry. When she was met with silence, she lit into the party leadership for leaving vulnerable Democrats not just confused about what they ought to do, but confused about what they were actually doing. Slotkin, meanwhile, had made similar critiques privately, arguing that the haphazard approach taken by the Judiciary Committee had made the process seem amateurish and made it harder for members like her to get behind it. Alexander McCoy, political director for the progressive veterans group Common Defense, said after meeting with more than 30 Democratic offices about impeachment over the last week, he came away with a sense that Democrats, and particularly frontliners, were deeply confused as to what the party's strategy is. These members of Congress were elected to deliver accountability to Donald Trump, but a lot of them are worried that the investigations process so far has been a confusing mess. The thing is, they're right, he said. The lobbying appeared to pay off as they met with 6 of the 7 signers of the Washington Post op-ed that broke the dam. Frustratingly for many House Democrats, not for many people, something that the Democrats did, but frustratingly for many of those actual House Democrats, their own political fortunes seem to be at the whim of intramural spats among senior members of the party, battling over turf or old grievances. A lot of it is turf wars at the top and a few loud frontliners that have been behind many of the worst votes we've had this year, said one member. Intelligence Committee Chair Adam Schiff, a California Democrat, has been one of the loudest voices against an impeachment inquiry, Democrats said, because his own committee, he argues, should be the venue for investigations. On CNN's State of the Union, he started to move in a hedged fashion over the weekend. The president is pushing us down this road, and if, in particular, after having sought foreign assistance and welcomed foreign assistance in the last presidential campaign as a candidate, he is now doing the same thing again, but now using the power of the presidency, he may then force us to go down this road. I've spoken with a number of colleagues over the last week, and this seems different in kind, and we may very well have crossed the Rubicon here. The Judiciary Committee, meanwhile, is riven with its own discord. The chair is held by Jerry Nadler of New York, who won a 2017 power struggle against Zoe Lofgren, a Californian who was close to Pelosi, after John Conyers was forced to resign. The wounds from that battle are still raw, Democrats say, producing an extra internal committee turmoil. On the Ways and Means Committee, Chair Richard Neal dragged his feet for months before requesting Trump's taxes from the IRS, as is his right. It's his right to demand them from the IRS. I guess it's also his right to drag his feet, but that's not, I don't think, what Ryan meant. His colleagues were driven mad by the slow process, which they suspected was driven by Neal's desire to get Trump and the GOP's buy-in for his retirement security legislation. After it passed the committee, Neal finally moved, though he now has a primary challenge from Alex Morse, the mayor of Holyoke. The same dynamic is playing out in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, chaired by Oregon Democrat Peter DeFazio. The Washington Post's David Farenthold, who has deeply investigated Trump's finances, and in particular his profiting off of the Trump Hotel in Washington, called out both Neal and DeFazio for slow-walking investigations. In Congress, there's also been two particular members of Congress who have the power to push these investigations, forward or to slow walk them, who have been accused by their colleagues of slow walking them. I guess this is Farenthold's writing here. That's Richard Neal, the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, and a guy named Peter DeFazio from Oregon, who was the head of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. That Transportation and Infrastructure Committee actually oversees Trump's D.C. hotel. Trump's D.C. hotel is located in a taxpayer-owned building under lease from the GSA, the General Services Administration. So that committee, DeFazio's committee, has the power to really dig into that if it wanted, and it hasn't really done very much. And the pushback from DeFazio's underlings, other members of Congress, has been that DeFazio is slow-walking this because he wants to make an infrastructure deal. Can you believe it? He still has some hope that Infrastructure Week will finally arrive like the Great Pumpkin, and he'll make a deal with Trump. DeFazio said, it's not true, but at the end, the result is that the taxpayers at the hotel the taxpayers own, we know so little about what Trump's doing there. I mean, that just sort of seems like that's a baby step of oversight, and they haven't done that. Returning to Ryan's reporting here, Representative Dina Titus of Nevada, who chairs a subcommittee that oversees Trump's hotels, blamed DeFazio on record for holding back in the hopes of cutting an infrastructure deal. Now DeFazio, too, has a primary challenge from organizer Doyle Canning, running explicitly on DeFazio's unwillingness to challenge Trump. If impeachment was ripened by the sunshine of insurgent primaries, the sudden movement forward threatens to wilt those challenges. Opponents who'd been blasting incumbents for being too soft on Trump needed to tweak their message in a way that drained it of some of its energy. too little too late, for instance, said Melanie D'Arrigo, I'm guessing, D''Arrigo, D'Arrigo, challenging Suozzi in New York, argued he had ignored a clear threat to our safety and national security for the sake of his GOP allies. Doyle Canning, who's challenging DeFazio, upped the demand, calling for a speedy floor vote. Oh, that's interesting. Now we should check whether Doyle Canning has any objections to moving swiftly, but just on Ukraine. That'd be interesting. Embedded in the story here is the quote from Doyle Canning: "Congressional Democrats must start impeachment today, setting a path for a floor vote to impeach Trump before 2020. Some, though, are lucky enough that their incumbent opponents are still clinging to the status quo, refusing to call for impeachment." Alex Morse here tweeting, while Richard Neal drags his feet on holding the president accountable on tax returns instead of leading the fight, he's been the biggest obstacle to corruption oversight. His refusal to support impeachment proceedings of the most corrupt president in history is unacceptable. That could change, however, at a moment's notice. And hey, for all we know, it's already changed in between then and now. Maybe it was over the weekend. Maybe it was before the weekend. I didn't get a chance to read through this thing until now, but it'd be interesting to take a look back and see whether those conditions have in fact changed on an individual case-by-case basis. Here's another item that I think could be useful. And again, everything we're offering up today is done with the assumption that, one, that Trump is still in office, and two, that there haven't been any blockbusters that render all of this information either moot or otherwise inoperative. But if we're still talking about the revelation that came toward the end of last week, that the actual transcript, if I understand what was going on, the actual transcript, not the non-transcript transcript, the actual transcript of the call between Trump and Zelensky was moved to this so-called secure top secret server. I thought that perhaps we would take this rundown from the plumb line, Greg Sargent, his explainer of exactly what that's all about. Under the headline, "The Whistleblower Alleged a Trump Cover-Up." Remember, this is now the cover-up phase of the Ukraine call scandal. "A former insider explains how it worked." What exactly was the deal with this? One of the most explosive claims in a now-released whistleblower complaint is that White House officials sought to cover up the details of the July 25th call that President Trump held with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. In that call, we've now learned, Trump pressured his counterpart to interfere in a U.S. election on his behalf by digging up dirt on potential opponent Joe Biden. The whistleblower claimed he'd learned of a broad-based campaign to engineer this foreign interference well beyond that one phone call. The whistleblower reported that White House officials were deeply disturbed by Trump's call with Zelensky, concluding that they had witnessed the president abuse his office for personal gain. After that, the whistleblower claimed, the White House officials sought to lock down the details of that call. How? Well, officials were directed, and that in quotes, by White House lawyers to, quote, remove the electronic transcript from the computer system in which such transcripts are typically stored, unquote, and load it onto a, quote, separate electronic system, unquote, normally used for, quote, classified information of an especially sensitive nature, unquote. One thing that this seems to be clarifying for me is that there may not necessarily be a recording of the call, although I'm still not positive that that doesn't exist at all. But I've seen it hinted elsewhere, and I guess this sort of is consistent. The language in this article is consistent with the hint I've picked up elsewhere, that I believe when I read it elsewhere, they said voice recognition software is used. So it's not that they are recording the call and then having a human, or a machine for that matter, transcribe from a recording what what was said as between the participants in the call, but rather, I guess that a computer is running voice recognition software and then, and dictation software, I guess would be a better, what we're really talking about here. And I guess voice recognition software along with it so that you can differentiate as between the two or more participants in a call, and creating an electronic transcript without the necessity of working from a recording and then transcribing it after the fact. So how could a transcription of the call exist if no recording of the call exists? It moves directly from live discussion to electronic transcript. Does that mean there isn't also a recording? No. But it was a little puzzling. How could there be a transcript if there's no recording? And I guess that clarifies it. Okay, so where were we? Officials directed by White House lawyers to remove the electronic transcript to a separate electronic system. And, I guess that's in common parlance the server, normally used for classified information of an especially sensitive nature. And the whistleblower claimed this happened repeatedly, not just with this call, I guess. This abuse of power is worse than it first appears once you drill down into the details of how this likely worked and what it means. For such an explanation, I spoke to Ned Price, a former senior director at the National Security Council, the President's advisory team on national security and foreign policy matters. An edited and condensed transcript, caught you, of our conversation follows. And it goes like this. Should we read it in computer voice or just regular voice? So the plumb line here, I guess here represented by Greg, although why he doesn't say Greg Sargent. He likes to refer to himself as plumb line. The whistleblower describes a computer system in which transcripts, like the one in this call, are typically stored for coordination, finalization, and distribution to cabinet-level officials. Can you describe this system? Price's answer, that's an allusion to a system that National Security Council staffers use to conduct the vast majority of classified business, to communicate about classified matters. That system can accommodate material that is classified up to the level of top secret. What other types of things are stored on this system, he's asked. The answer is it's 99.9% of the classified business that NSC does. Correspondence with the State Department, correspondence with the intelligence community, correspondence with others in the policy community. This is essentially the go-to computer system for nearly all classified business of the NSC staff. Next question. The whistleblower complaint then says the transcript was loaded onto a separate electronic system that is otherwise used to store and handle classified information of an especially sensitive nature. Can you describe that system? All right. And here the answer. As described in the complaint, this is a system to which very few people on the NSC staff have access. These staffers form part of what is known as the NSC Directorate for Intelligence Programs. These are the very few career officials whose job is to oversee and safeguard the most sensitive information. Isn't that the designation that they had planned to give to Steve Bannon at some point before there was objection? This system can retain information up to the classification level that's known as top secret/code word. That refers to a series of special compartments within the realm of top secret information. How large a group in this directorate would have access to this? The answer, no more than a handful. They are career officials from within the intelligence community who have, throughout their professional lives, dealt with extraordinarily sensitive information. They come from the CIA, the National Security Agency, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, among other departments and agencies. Unlike other career officials who may come from non-intelligence community components, they are specially trained to safeguard and protect top secret code word information. Interestingly, it appears here twice, so we can say it's not a typo. The way this is printed out is top secret // code word information. It may even be a space between the slash. I don't know how you designate that as. Is that top secret slash code word or just top secret code word? And what do those slashes mean? Why two? I'm very curious to find out. But I don't think that this article tells us. Anyway, what type of material is generally stored on this much more sensitive system? It's supposed to be the most sensitive information within our government's possession. Notionally speaking, that could include covert action programs overseen by NSC staff but run by the CIA. It could include extraordinarily sensitive intelligence information that emanates from the most precious intelligence sources. There is supposed to be a bare minimum of information on that system because it is so highly protected and segregated from other classified systems. So, is it unusual to store something like this call transcript on there? The whistleblower says one White House official described this as an act of abuse of this electronic system because the call did not contain anything remotely sensitive from a national security perspective. The executive order, the answer begins, that governs classified information specifically forbids classification in order to protect information that's embarrassing or otherwise politically sensitive. This is something Congress would want to look at. Yeah, it's something we've discussed in the past, that there's always people's fear that embarrassing or politically sensitive information would be incorrectly, but more than incorrectly, but inappropriately designated as secure, highly top secret information so that you could use the national security law to hide it from people, and people have worried about that for a long time. But Congress did anticipate. One of the few things that Congress anticipates ahead of time, the abuses anyway, they did anticipate this kind of abuse, and they forbade it, but, they've forbidden lots of things that people have ignored. So, okay. This system is highly regulated, the answer continues, and protected with the most rigorous safeguards available. The introduction of any materials that don't meet that very high threshold corrupts the integrity of that system. It's now going to be under tremendous scrutiny, including by Congress. That'll be interesting. They want to parse through what's there to see what else might be hidden inappropriately. That poses a real problem. This has the potential to make information that should be on the system more vulnerable and expose it to additional eyeballs and to additional risk, which has the potential to do tremendous harm. Next question. An appendix in the whistleblower's complaint says, according to White House officials I spoke with, this was not the first time under this administration that a presidential transcript was placed into this code word level system, solely for the purpose of protecting politically sensitive rather than national security sensitive information. Is placing anything in this system because of its political sensitivity itself an abuse of power? What does it mean that it may have happened multiple times? The answer, it means officials leveraged infrastructure designed to protect our most sensitive secrets to protect the president himself. What recourse is there at this point? Congress needs to determine if these calls represented additional attempts by Trump to put his own personal and political interests ahead of the national interest. Congress must also scrutinize whether the preservation of records of those calls on this particular system points to an attempted cover-up by those around the president. All right, that sums it up pretty neatly. Brings up a good point, though. In order to be sure that Trump and company haven't been hiding even more information improperly, inappropriately on this system, somebody's going to have to look through it. And I don't know whether there's anybody with the top secret clearance that it would ordinarily require to look through this material, but who could also be trusted to be an honest broker in all of this, or whether we're going to have to get one of the FISA judges who, regularly deals with sensitive and classified information in camera to look through this. But it could certainly potentially cause alarm, and it may require additional exposure of this material, which is kind of annoying and maybe dangerous all by itself. Interesting. All right. Well, consider us to be caught up with that one again, unless anything really wacky happened over the weekend. So, with all of this now happening and things moving forward on the possible impeachment, the further probing of the Ukraine side of the story, moving very quickly, or maybe not, we'll find out. We'll see what happens. There hasn't been much focus on what is Ukraine going to do next about this. They're still between a rock and a hard place. And though the funding has been released, we don't know. So far it's been said that Trump has released the funding, but has the check cleared? Is the money in their hands or not? I don't know. Do they feel like they're subject to other pressures? I don't know. That's what raised my eyebrows when I saw it reported early last week. The headline in the Daily Beast, Ukraine likely to reopen probe of Hunter Biden firm, according to sources. But they put a damper on it pretty early in the piece here. Anna Nemtsova is the writer in this one. President Zelensky came to office vowing to fight corruption, and it looks like he'll open a lot of cases shut by shady prosecutors. But the focus is on Ukraine, not the U.S. That's what the subheader says. The body of the story begins this way. The Daily Beast has learned from an influential member of Ukraine's parliament, from one of the country's prosecutors, and from a center combating corruption, that the government here is likely to pursue the cases that President Donald Trump urged on President Vladimir Zelensky in a controversial phone call last July. But not the way Trump intends, and not necessarily to the detriment of Trump challenger Joe Biden. The investigations and possible prosecutions, if they happen, would take place in the context of a new law signed by Zelensky just before his departure for the United Nations General Assembly in New York, which was last week, where he is expected, or was expected last week, to meet face-to-face with Trump for the first time. It happened. It wasn't great or productive. In Kiev, there are widespread hopes that the reforms will help Zelensky, a former comedian who played a corruption-fighting president on television. You gotta land a role like that. See, that's how it works. I did not realize that. I knew he was a comedian. I didn't realize he played a corruption-fighting president on television. Wow. I don't know how I feel about that. Anyway, it's hoped that these reforms will help him deliver on his campaign promise to clean up Ukraine for real. A new team of independent prosecutors is supposed to reopen investigations of past cases and answer questions about the corruption in post-revolutionary Ukraine over the last 5 years. During much of that time, investigations were launched against various powerful oligarchs, then quietly shut down when, it was widely assumed, the prosecutors were paid off. As a result, it has been hard to know if the investigations were justified or merely launched for purposes of extortion. We are trying, ultimately, to reset the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine to speed up the reform. Kirill Tymoshenko, deputy head of the presidential administration in Ukraine, told the Daily Beast on Tuesday. Okay, a little stilted in the terminology there. Not used to it. Anyway, in accordance with the new law, all Ukrainian prosecutors will go through a process of recertification. The number of prosecutors will be cut down from 15,000 to 10,000. Tymoshenko said he could not comment on specific cases and could not say more about Zelensky's agenda for the meeting with Trump on Wednesday. Valentin Nalyvachenko. How about that? Valentin Nalyvachenko, the former head of Ukraine's domestic intelligence agency and a member of Ukraine's parliament, says he expects the corruption case of the Burisma gas company, 2 cases were opened and dropped by various prosecutors over the years, to be revisited. Hunter Biden, the son of then Vice President Joe Biden, was a board member. That much we know. Joe Biden is now Trump's leading opponent. It's up to dispute, but there you go. His leading opponent in the 2020 U.S. presidential elections, and both Trump and his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, have been working to find dirt on Biden in Ukraine. Nalivachenko said his country will be best served by pursuing an investigation related to Burisma's alleged multi-million-dollar corruption deals, not because of Trump's pressure, but because Ukraine wants to know the truth about its own corruption, whether the founder of Burisma, Ukraine's ex-minister of natural resources, Mykola Zlochevsky, from 2010 to 2012, has paid to quash the earlier investigations into the way he acquired gas licenses. In an executive interview with the Daily Beast, an exclusive interview. I was like, what's an executive interview? Well, it's nothing. It's an exclusive interview with the Daily Beast. Nalivachenko said Ukraine's parliament is planning to hold hearings about the various corrupt schemes. Nalivachenko, who is a member of the opposition Fatherland Party, serves in a parliamentary group focused on U.S.-Ukraine relations. I am going to support President Zelensky's initiatives to have new investigations by a new team at the law enforcement agency, Nalivachenko said. This would include inquiries into the actions of previous prosecutor generals Yuri Lutsenko and Viktor Shokin. That's the guy whose name I couldn't remember on Friday, I think. The S prosecutor. Shokin. I am convinced, he said, that Zelensky will say in New York, I don't know if he did or not, let's think. He will say in New York that these are our domestic investigations. We are going to figure them out on our own. He added, however, we'd be happy to cooperate with the FBI. Prosecutor Sergei Gorbatyuk, my best guess at that one, Gorbatyuk investigated the founder of Burisma company, Zlochevsky, for 3 months in 2016, until Prosecutor General Lutsenko made a decision to drop the probe. First, Lutsenko took the case away from the investigators, then closed it down illegally, Gorbatyuk told the Daily Beast on Tuesday. There would not have been any question about pursuing such cases today if Lutsenko did not interfere in the investigations, the prosecutor said. I hope that with the change of management at the Prosecutor General's office, there will be no legal interferences, and this case, as well as other probes, will be investigated strictly in accordance with the law. All right, there's a bit more here. A leading Ukrainian sociologist, Irina, more names, more Ukrainian names. Bekeshkina, Irina Bekeshkina, says there is powerful will in Zelensky's team and a strong social demand to see some former corrupt bureaucrats in jail. It is not the number of punished criminals, but their status that will make a difference and set a good example, Bekeshkina said. We are going to see some big former decision makers behind bars very soon, I have no doubt. We'll see what happens. The Ukraine scandal has rocked American politics, where opponents of Trump have fixated on reports that, at least implicitly, he threatened to withhold vital military aid from Ukraine if Zelensky did not pursue the Burisma case. Trump has said there was no quid pro quo, but admits that he raised the issue of Burisma and the Biden connection in his July 25th phone call with Zelensky as part of a discussion about corruption. A major part of the Trump narrative is that in 2016, then Vice President Biden pressed for the resignation of Shokin in order to protect his son. That is not the way people in Ukraine remember things. Lutsenko's reputation for corruption was infamous, and Biden supported the efforts of Ukraine's reformers to be rid of him. But that sort of conflates things there. Does that not? A major part of the narrative in 2016 was that Biden pressed for Shokin's resignation to protect his son. Not the way it's remembered in Ukraine. Lutsenko's reputation for corruption was infamous. What about Shokin? I mean, I think his was too. Maybe it's just a slip. I mean, I think they both are, but this confuses things. Anyway, so Lutsenko also, I guess, had a reputation for corruption, maybe. And Biden supported the efforts of Ukraine's reformers to be rid of him. According to Nalivichenko, Lutsenko needs to be investigated further, not least because he has been in communication with Trump's agents for vindictive purposes. Nalivichenko said Ukraine should also be interested in a thorough investigation into the Black Ledger that recorded slush fund payments to Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort. As it turns out, nobody really investigated that case properly, Nalivichenko said. Officials close to former President Petro Poroshenko mentioned two names of the U.S. citizens. Well, I think an extraneous "the" in there. One was Paul Manafort, who lost his job as Trump campaign manager, and the other, Larry King, was never talked about again. Larry King. Ukraine previously suspected the well-known television host Larry King of accepting $225,000 from the Black Ledger for interviewing a pro-Russian politician in 2011. At the time of the allegations, King hosted the Larry King Now show on RT America. Oh, right. The Kremlin's propaganda channel. At the time, King did not respond to requests for comment from Ukraine's Kiev Post. And as Nalivichenko says, the allegations faded away. Well, one, I guess I'm not that interested in nailing Larry King. Is Larry King alive? I don't know. I mean, seriously, come on. You know that he's one of the people that people speculate about all the time. Is he dead or is he not? I mean, he's getting up there, and he looks like he's getting up there. And also, The Weeknd may have intervened. It's exciting times. You don't know what's going to happen. But I was going to say, in 2011, not only do I not care about nailing Larry King, but he's at the time, I guess he doesn't host. I assume he's retired by now, but I really have no idea. But at the time, he was hosting Larry King Now on RT America, which, sets off alarm bells now. But in 2011, we were still sort of thinking, well, it is a little weird that Russia maintains a television station here. But, and there was some thinking that maybe it was sort of a trolling kind of situation, because I think in 2011 things might have changed. But as I recall, during the latter part of the George W. Bush administration, there were an awful lot of liberal-leaning shows that got time on RT, which was great in the sense that we were seeing a lot of television news-looking clips that expressed explicitly liberal viewpoints, but I got the little sense even then, that, well, they really seem to be doing it for trolling purposes. But it didn't occur to me how far Russian trolling would go at that point. But it seemed like they were saying, well, in order to antagonize the current American administration, we will put political talk shows on the air that are antagonistic to whatever the current regime is. I don't know that I recall them actually switching once Obama became president or anything like that. But there was always this weird vibe about RT. And I think, I never watched any of the shows, but I do recall, I believe, I've responded to interview requests from 2 RT shows during that period. And I had my doubts about things. People were saying, there's something a little weird and hinky about RT. And I got the same feeling, although I never got the feeling that the hosts of the shows had compromised themselves politically in any way. But, I wasn't getting any money for the appearances, so it's hard to feel like you're getting politically compromised. If you're not getting paid, you got to get paid to feel politically compromised, I feel, to do it properly. But also, I believe at least one of the appearances was, at the time, ironically enough, being given in support of the proposition that George Bush ought to be impeached. So anyway, I don't know. I guess in the end, who cares about Larry King? It's just sort of a weird and interesting footnote. So, back to the Daily Beast piece here. There are high expectations in Ukraine this week surrounding Zelensky's meetings on the sidelines of the United Nations. That would, of course, have been last week. In a Ukrainian dream scenario, Kiev would want Zelensky to agree with Western leaders on an approach to settling the war in the East. There has been talk here, at least, of a sweeping peace treaty in the works. And as I recall, as part of the Mueller investigation and Michael Cohen going to jail, he was carrying some sort of secret peace treaty negotiation, peace settlement negotiation document from where? I don't even remember. From Russia to Trump, and I don't know. It just brings back memories of that. And, they haven't settled things yet. Sovereignty is not just a word here. Threatened as Ukraine is by Russian President Vladimir Putin's irredentist ambition to resurrect the Russian Empire. Since 2014, Ukraine has paid with thousands of lives and territory, first during the uprising on Independence Square, and thereafter during the war that has raged since. Memories are long in such conflicts, and efforts to help are deeply appreciated. Nalivachenko, yes, right, back to that. Nalivachenko says he has no ill will toward Biden. He remembers the U.S. vice president as one of the bravest Ukraine friends coming from Washington during the first and most violent year of war with the Kremlin-backed forces. Biden asked me about Russian aggression at a time when not many believed in it, Nalivachenko said. He said Ukraine's intelligence service shared with U.S. officials data they had at the time on Russian military forces fighting in Ukraine. Nalivachenko said Biden did not shrink from denouncing corruption. He's a man of sharp and fresh thoughts. He had no fear to turn with his face to the government, to our prime minister and top politicians and say, you have corruption at a high level. Has that come back to haunt us here? Of course, this whole thing has been perverted by the Trump forces, and we've got some updates on that for you as well. The executive director of the Center for Combating Corruption, Daria Kalenyuk, said that all of Ukraine's corruption fighters expect the Burisma probe to be expect the Burisma probe to be reopened. The Burisma case has been a systematic problem for years. First, Prosecutor General Viktor Shokin, then Lutsenko, blocked the criminal investigations. Kalenyuk told the Daily Beast on Tuesday, the pressure from Joe Biden was really needed. We welcomed it with gratitude. Now it is up to the newly formed team of prosecutors to revisit the probe. And yes, the later reporting on this it's new reporting about old reporting, reminding us that, if anything, Biden's insistence on getting rid of the then current prosecutors in Ukraine would have sharpened things, would have deepened trouble for Burisma. It was the fact that the then current prosecutors, refused to look into Burisma that drove much of the international community's outrage about them. So if anything, Biden is there to urge them to look into the company that Hunter Biden is on the board of. That, of course, has been turned entirely upside down. But I guess it only served as the kernel of truth from which the Trumpists decided to depart from reality and turn the story inside out and upside down and turn it into a Biden scandal. International experts working in Ukraine also have strong memories of Biden's move to pressure Ukraine to fire the top prosecutor, Viktor Shokin, in 2016. The U.S. law enforcement community was very supportive of the efforts to oust Shokin at the time, working with civil society. Donald Bowser, a former advisor on institution building, told the Daily Beast. I didn't know you could be an advisor on that. In 2016, Bowser's group advised NABU, Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Agency. For example, a current serving Republican congressman, Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, was seconded by the FBI in Kiev at the time of the push to oust Shokin. He was helping on the anti-corruption efforts. Bowser also suggested it was time to pay attention to one of the erroneous statements by Trump lawyer Rudolph Giuliani. Giuliani claims the Anti-Corruption Center, ANTAC, A-N-T-A-C, was George Soros funded, he said, but they were mostly funded by INL, the Bureau, it says here in brackets, the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement of the State Department. State Department enters the picture from another angle. Member of Parliament Nalivichenko, still can't get that quite right, welcomed President Trump's and Vice President Mike Pence's critical statements about Ukraine's corruption, but pointed out how important it was for Kiev to remember its own history, value its old friends, and keep good relationships with all political powers in the United States, Ukraine's most important strategic partner. Please understand this correctly. Our bipartisan position, U.S. support, is very important for us as a state, which is, of course, exactly how it came to be used as leverage by Donald Trump. Okay, so to pick up on something that I left you with just before the weekend, I think we snuck this in just under the wire on Friday's show. I wanted to introduce a couple more names of other State Department officials, ambassadors, who had somehow gotten themselves mixed up in the Ukraine story, being pulled in by Rudy Giuliani into the Ukraine story. And I mentioned, two names, but among them was Ambassador Kurt Volker, U.S. Special Representative to Ukraine. And good thing I went with my instincts on that one to sneak that name in at the end of Friday's show, because over the weekend, it turns out Volker is out. He's resigned. He's gone. And there's some very interesting story behind that, as you might have imagined. Now, two interesting things, I guess, about that story. First of all, the story itself, that he has resigned, and I can give you that story. But where will I turn for that story is the big question. You could read it in the New York Times. They reported on it. But apparently, somehow, I'm not even sure how this, would happen. I guess they had this special state-based angle on it. The state press, that is the student newspaper at Arizona State, broke the story of Kurt Volker's resignation. And that's amazing enough in itself. I mean, what an accomplishment for them to have done that. But I guess, then it became a story about the story as the New York Times then rolled out its own version of the story, not at all crediting the work of the student journalists at the state press, which is really insulting in a number of ways. But I think they've revised their story and finally gave them some credit for it, but not before I saw them called out widely on Twitter. I think the way that they managed to get this scoop is that Kurt Volker has an Arizona tie. He is, in addition to serving in the State Department, the executive director of the McCain Institute, which I don't even know what it is, but certainly it seems to have some connection with Arizona State University, and so I guess that's how they managed to find themselves in position to get this scoop. He's got this tie to ASU, and they picked up on it. So we'll do them the favor or the honor of reading their story for the background on Volker's resignation. McCain Institute head Kurt Volker steps down as U.S. diplomat. Volker's resignation comes amid reports that he was involved in the Trump-Ukraine investigation. Yes, he was. The article by Andrew Howard. So congratulations to Andrew Howard. Executive Director of the McCain Institute, Kurt Volker, resigned from his position as the U.S. Special Envoy for Ukraine Friday, following reports he collaborated with Ukraine and President Donald Trump. And it's quite a story. I'll read this one, but we have some follow-up material on this. It doesn't end here. An ASU official confirmed Volker's resignation Friday and said the university could not speak about his future at ASU because the university does not comment on personnel matters. Volker met with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Friday to announce he would be resigning, the official said. Volker's name was mentioned in the recent whistleblower complaint, which has sparked an impeachment inquiry for Trump. Trump has defended his actions, that is his own actions, he doesn't care about defending Volker's actions, including a phone call with Ukraine President Vladimir Zelensky, where Trump requested dirt on former Vice President Joe Biden. The complaint details that Trump told his staff to cut aid to Ukraine unless they helped find information on presidential candidate Biden's son, Hunter Biden. According to the complaint, Volker helped organize meetings with Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani and Ukrainian officials. The complaint also alleges that Volker went to Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, to help guide Ukraine officials on how to handle Trump's demands. Very interesting, and it's just that little blurb, and then they note at the bottom, editors note this is a breaking story. They'll be updating it later. But I thought I'd at least give you the basic facts based on the original reporting of those facts from the state press. Congrats to you guys. Now, what the hell does that mean, and what is it all about? I have this story for you, which helps explain a little bit of this, and there are a couple others out there sort of about the Volker situation, but here's a value-added look at it from Columbia Journalism Review. Keith Gessen, Gessen, reporting for this, and let me just give you the story. Another intriguing title, How I Missed the Ukraine Story. I guess he had an early look at it and didn't see it for what it would later become. And I wondered, how could you possibly miss it? And it's because, of course, he came at it from a very different angle and very early on, even though lots of people knew about the pressure being applied on Ukraine by Rudy Giuliani. This, I think, is an interesting angle on it. I've actually already read this one. And a great point is made in here that caused me to tweet it out singly. I'll see if I can remember it once I pass by it in the reading here. In early August, I met Ambassador Kurt Volker, U.S. Special Representative to Ukraine, in Washington, D.C. Volker, 54, is one of a handful of, quote, ordinary foreign policy Republicans. Confident of American power, hawkish on Russia, eager to expand NATO. That's what makes a ordinary foreign policy Republican. But he's one of a number of them who have come to occupy senior positions in the Trump administration because there just aren't enough qualified Trumpians to fill the seats. He told me that in the summer and fall of 2016, he'd been sent a lot of the Never Trump letters circulating among Republican establishmentarians, and he declined to sign them. So right away, a little bit suspect, right? Listen to his explanation. He says, if he wins, he recalled saying of Trump, he's going to need good people in government. So why put all their names on a blacklist? I mean, it's a thought, except maybe he's not that good a person, and he's now mixed up in this Ukraine thing. But this is a very interesting angle to be taking on this stuff, because now we open up the possibility that he is not necessarily a backroom manipulator dedicated to Trump and out to execute the Trump agenda. He might be, if not a never Trumper, then certainly an outsider to the Trump circle, but filling in the hopes of being, I guess he'd be identified otherwise as a deep state type by the Trumpian people who would think he's really only here to thwart our allowing Trump to be Trump, and to keep him within the confines of the sort of diplomacy that the deep state would approve of. Is he that? I don't know. If he is, I don't care very much. But what also becomes interesting is once again, somebody who steps in with moderately good intentions ends up getting destroyed in the Trump ego machine. So, there's also that. Anyway, so A lot of people circulated those Never Trump letters to him. He didn't sign on to them, thinking he's going to need good people in government. Why put my name on a blacklist? In the spring of 2017, Volker signed on to coordinate U.S. policy on Ukraine, which was struggling to resolve multinational negotiations to end the fighting in the east of the country and preserve its territorial integrity. I, that is our writer here, Keith Gesson, was meeting with Volker as part of my research for a book on post-Soviet Russia hands. That's in quotes. What are Russia hands? That is the people in the U.S. government who have worked on Russia policy in the aftermath of the Cold War. Volker was not a Russia hand, but he was a Russia hawk. He'd served on the National Security Council as a director for Europe and as the U.S. ambassador to NATO. He'd been active in debates over NATO expansion in the George W. Bush administration. We talked about that. Also, I was curious to know what it was like for an ordinary Republican to be working for this very unordinary president. I asked about that, too. Volker put on a brave face. It's been 2 years, he said, since his appointment. I am very, very happy. Trump, he admitted, has a built-in negative bias against Ukraine. He thinks it's corrupt. They're all terrible people. It's a horribly corrupt country. You can't fix it, and it's not worth it. But Volker thought he was bringing Trump around to his perspective, which was that the election of President Vladimir Zelensky represented the best hope for Ukraine to clean up since it had gained its independence. In a meeting after Zelensky's election in April, Volker and others had argued to Trump that Zelensky agreed with him about corruption being a major problem in Ukraine. Volker told me that they'd managed to get Trump on the phone with Zelensky twice. And remember, we've now learned since that there was a call in April after this discussion and then another call in July. So, so far from this perspective, it sounds like Volker is, he's a Republican, but he's like a supposedly normal Republican trying to bring Trump around on Ukraine and saying, look, this guy is an anti-corruption candidate. He's on the up and up. He's got a chance to actually root out some of the corruption in Ukraine. And this is their best chance that they've had yet. You got to talk to this guy. So I think that's really kind of interesting. We said, talk to him. Talk to this guy. We've met him. We think he's for real. You should talk with him. Imagine, urging this line only to find out at the end that Trump himself is so corrupt that he ends up corrupting the anti-corruption guy, or trying to anyway, and everybody is brought down by this and he ends up having to resign. I mean, what a great everything Trump touches dies story. Let's continue on here. Nothing in Volker's manner or the way he described the calls, proudly, indicated that they had been catastrophic for Trump and would eventually threaten to bring down his administration. Ukraine policy was trending in the right direction, Volker told me. He's focused entirely on the policy and not on what insane thing did the president say, because he can't look at that. If he's worried about what the president says that's insane, he couldn't serve. He's just, I know, he's nuts. I just have to be the fixer outside afterwards that makes normal policy. I have to normalize Trump. That's his job, and that's a bad job to take. And you're a bad person for taking it, but I can almost understand it if I start from the perspective that it's okay to be a Republican, which it's not. But okay. Where were we in this? Okay, so he's kind of proud of the calls, although no one has seen the transcript at this point. But the gist of the call was supposed to be, about helping the Ukrainians fight corruption. But Trump couldn't help but try and shoehorn his own agenda into it. But he's sort of ignoring that because, Trump's Trump. But the real point of the call was anti-corruption, so things are going well. Ukraine policy, he's saying, is trending in the right direction. Volker told me he was optimistic. There isn't a single thing, whether it's the arms sales or the sanctions or the rhetoric on Russia or Crimea non-recognition or engaging the new president. Not a single thing where we have not done the right thing. And it's funny because that sounds so much like Trump's insistence that his call was perfect. And I'm sure that Volcker told him something like this. And Trump came away thinking, no, the call was perfect because our policy has been perfect. The problem was that Trump, on top of the policy, tries to shoehorn in the extortion. That part is not so perfect. But I think that might be where the language comes from. Anyway, the article continues, I left the meeting thinking that, well, Trump might be awful and unpredictable, but so long as he doesn't care too much about something, and he seemed not to care too much about Ukraine, the ordinary course of U.S. policy, think what you will basically continue. I was impressed, too, with Volcker's openness, his willingness to talk, a stark contrast to many State Department officials during this administration who are so uncertain of where things stand that they have buried their heads and mostly refused to speak with reporters. What's going on in this paragraph, I think, is also very interesting. Although I have to take issue with the idea. I sort of agree. He seems to not care very much about Ukraine, Trump. True, personally. But then again, remember that the one and only thing that got changed in the Republican platform during the 2016 Republican convention had to do with Ukraine. Also had to do with Russia, because you can't discuss Ukraine without Russia, no matter how much you try to separate them. Or try to do that for political purposes of just focusing the impeachment inquiry, etc. Even the speaker can see this. There's no Ukraine issue without Russia. There just isn't. So anyway, but just an interesting sort of thing, and I think maybe even here Gessen would probably concede that and say, oh, yeah. I mean, I don't feel like that makes me think that Donald Trump personally cares very much about Ukraine. It just means somebody else cares about Ukraine. Somebody else knows that Russia can be, placated, sweet-talked, bribed, I don't know, by agreeing to do their bidding, whether they were asked about it or not, with regard to Ukraine. And Trump said, hell with it, I don't care. At best. At worst, he may have said, oh, well, Russia will love this, so let's do this thing on Ukraine. Okay, article continues now. I now know that Volcker wasn't being entirely open with me. Yes. At the time of the meeting, U.S. military aid to Ukraine had been held up for weeks. And as I learned yesterday from the whistleblower complaint, Volcker had been in Kiev several days before we spoke, doing damage control. On a July 25th phone call, Trump had tried to pressure Zelensky to search for the servers of the Democratic National Committee and figure out a way to prosecute the Bidens. Further, he had apparently advised Zelensky on the matter of how. I also learned from the whistleblower complaint that Volcker had talked with Rudy Giuliani, Trump's lawyer, about these activities in order to, quote, contain the damage. These words are in quotes in the whistleblower complaint as well, he notes parenthetically. Earlier last week, as the scandal unraveled and Giuliani appeared on TV aiming to defend himself, he said that he had been put in touch with Ukrainian officials by, quote, the State Department. The person he was talking about was Volcker. Now, he goes on to say, to be fair to Volcker, I didn't ask him about all that when we met over the summer. I had seen news reports out of the corner of my eye that Giuliani was mucking about in Ukraine. I had seen, too, in some of Trump's tweets and public comments that he thought Ukraine had somehow meddled in the 2016 election. But I didn't take any of that seriously. Why would I? There were so many controversies to sift through. Were the happenings in Ukraine in the same league, I guess the supposed happenings in Ukraine, in the same league as the, quote, millions of people who had supposedly voted illegally to give Hillary Clinton the edge in the popular vote? Were they as in the same league as the Obama tapped my phone tweet? As Pizzagate? It all seemed like more of the same right-wing conspiratorial craziness. This stuff did not belong in a serious conversation about U.S. foreign policy. And he's right, it didn't, and it was crazy. But I guess what he's copping to here is, I didn't really think, I don't know, I guess I didn't think the president was serious about that. He was just spouting something maybe that he'd seen on television. And this is the first indication that he was, as serious as Trump can get. I saw it on TV, and it's real because I saw it on TV. And here, in this next paragraph, he really sums it all up. The seriousness of his mistake in not taking Trump seriously, and the seriousness of, as we've said here on the show, having a programmable, empty-headed moron as president who's susceptible to believing right-wing conspiratorial BS that he sees on television and then setting policy based on it. This is all it right here in this paragraph. What I didn't realize, what, to be fair now to me, none of the Russia hands I spoke to this summer realized, was that the president had been working hand in glove with Giuliani. Now, I don't know how you missed that. I mean, Giuliani, he kept saying he was working on behalf of the president. I'm working for my client, Donald Trump. So what does this mean? What I didn't realize was that the president had been working hand in glove with Giuliani. We all should have figured, just because Trump's Clinton-Biden conspiracy theories are fantastical, does not mean that they wouldn't, in a real way, direct foreign policy. In the immortal words of footnote 3 of the whistleblower complaint, regarding a belief on Trump's part that the DNC servers are in Ukraine for some reason, here's what the footnote of the whistleblower's report says, quote, I do not know why the president associates these servers with Ukraine, unquote. I do not know why the president associates these servers with Ukraine. Gessen continues and says, well, no one knows, but it doesn't matter because he's the president. That's what I've been talking about here, is it doesn't matter how insane it is and how how little evidence there is that there could even be an insane connection. It doesn't matter because it's being uttered by the president. Now it's actionable, and arms of the United States federal government have to swing into action because essentially a street corner lunatic has babbled this stuff. But somewhere along the line, we the people, even though everybody voted for Hillary Clinton by 3 million plus, somehow along the line, we the people, the constitutional system of government, has imbued a street corner lunatic with the full powers of the presidency. And that's extraordinarily dangerous, and nobody ever anticipated it, and we've given away all sorts of amazing powers, sweeping powers to the president of the United States, all on the premise that, well, we won't elect a street corner lunatic. What's even worse is we didn't elect a street corner lunatic. We voted for Hillary Clinton. The Electoral College, which of course was established in order to avoid the one instance in which the founders actually anticipated the possibility of accidentally or otherwise electing a street corner lunatic. They said, don't worry, the Electoral College will protect the United States. The Electoral College will be serious people. They would never elect, they would never give their imprimatur, the constitutional imprimatur, to a street corner lunatic, despite what the people want. Well, what if the people, by overwhelming margins, 3 to 5 million votes, let's say, vote, well, we know what the actual margin is because we're using the real number. So 3 million votes for a street corner lunatic. Would the Electoral College really stand athwart history and yell stop and say, we just refuse? Yes, that was the thinking. However, as it turns out, it was kind of the opposite and we're all screwed. So I don't know. I thought that was an extraordinarily important paragraph in all this, even though I don't think it was the point of writing this piece. But it's got that meaning, and it's also just got the plain operational meaning that as crazy as the things are that he says, there are people who swing into action when he says them because he's president. Some of them swing into action so that he doesn't become embarrassed in some way. Let's say he says, I'm doing this policy, blah. And everybody in government says, this policy is not happening. We have not been working on this. And there are people who scramble to make it happen or make it appear as though it's happening so that the president isn't politically embarrassed. But there are also actual policy hands or people who occupy the offices that are supposed to belong to actual policy hands who try and make it happen outside of the question of whether he would be embarrassed if it wasn't happening. They say this is a good and smart thing, and we should be doing it because the president of the United States recommends it, and only a smart person capable of leading this country would be United States president, or whatever. Or I just believe in everything Trump says, and everything he says is a good idea, and we're going to do that. I don't know which of the 2 or 3 different kinds of person it has to be driving something like this, but the point here is that even stuff that doesn't have any place in rational conversation among sane human beings, when the president says it, the press has to kind of try and normalize it. We have to edit the transcript a little bit so that there's structure to the sentences and a policy can be discerned. And for the rest of you suckers, the rest of the world, now there's just going to be tension between the United States and Ukraine, and there'll be continued war between Ukraine and Russia, when that might have been avoided by a smart person being president of the United States, but a street corner lunatic who's in thrall to the president of Russia is president now. And although this thing you're doing is against United States interests and very spectacularly in Russia's interests, we are going to do it because the person, the idiot street corner lunatic who said it, who we would dismiss otherwise, has the, has the chair, has the suit, and says he's president. So now we've got to do it. The Ukraine scandal now engulfing the Trump presidency presents a fascinating contrast to Russiagate, Gessen continues. The scale is so much smaller this time around. The story so much simpler. Here, Trump used his position to shake down a newly elected president of a medium-sized Eastern European country. In Russiagate, by contrast, the president stood accused of taking part in a complex operation involving the theft by the Russian secret services of documents from the servers of the DNC. A small-time bit of extortion of a supplicant, in the Ukraine case, versus a vast conspiracy with a formidable partner, in the case of Russia. One of these fits Trump's way of doing things, the other does not. That, I thought, was an interesting point, although I think a lot of us understood Trump to be a small-time player in his own, inside the vast conspiracy of his own election, possibly. But an interesting point, nonetheless. I mean, I don't think it by itself, and I don't think it's offered to make the argument, say, for instance, that you should concentrate on Ukraine and nothing else in terms of impeachment, or at least first. But it's an interesting point. The Ukraine part is a microcosm of the Russia part. And in a way, much easier to, in a way, meaning the facts point immediately to this. It's just easier to hang directly on Trump. I did this thing. I made this phone call and I said these things to this person. And then I blurted it out. And we don't need to interview oligarchs who are not extraditable to our country, etc., to find out what happened and why. All right. Continuing on, we're now in a news cycle that is much more like that of a classic American political scandal. That, I think, is why the strategists say focus on Ukraine. It's not what Gessen is saying, but this is that's perhaps why. And so Gessen's just saying this is much more recognizable as a classic American political scandal, more like Watergate, more like Iran-Contra. rather than a single document laying out a grand conspiracy, as the dossier compiled by Christopher Steele seemed to do. We've got a lot of good but incomplete reporting in this story. The whistleblower complaint is admirably restrained about what its author does and does not know. The evidence we have is confusing. The July call and the April call. The Director of National Intelligence, the Inspector General, Giuliani, Volcker. It's a jumble. But that's good. Journalists will have some work to do to piece the story together. There are things we don't know yet, but we'll soon find out. That is how American political scandals form in the press and in the eyes of the public. What next? In terms of coverage, the media finds itself with a dilemma not unlike the one it faced in October of 2016. A major Democratic politician, then Hillary Clinton, now Joe Biden, has been caught out in a minor scandal. She shouldn't have used a private server. As for Biden, no way should his son have ever been operating in Ukraine. That may be valid. Whereas Trump is engaged in full-scale criminality. This time, it seems, journalists have learned their lesson. I'm not so sure about that. So, I missed the real Ukraine news, even as I sat in the same room as one of its major players just a week after Trump's fateful phone call. I was underprepared. I was naive. I asked about American policy and the Minsk Accords and the NATO expansion. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the real work of this administration was taking place. That's the end of the article. And I guess left unsaid here, just to reiterate the part from the previous paragraph that Trump is engaged in full-scale criminality here. The way he ended up missing the story is he's sitting in there with the special representative for Ukraine and asks him about serious policy about Ukraine. What about NATO expansion? What about the Minsk Accords and American policy towards Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera? And I'm not sure how he would have known it, except to know, as many people did, Trump is an outright criminal. But imagine sitting down with the ambassador and thinking that the proper line of questioning is, what sort of criminality is the president involved in the country you are a special rapporteur with? That would never occur to most reporters, unless, of course, somebody had already broken the story or he had some sort of inside information. But that's where we are. So from now on, all of you reporters covering the Trump administration, when you sit down, when you get access to a Trump administration official, I guess the first question out of your mouth is, what illegality can you tell me about that the president's involved in your area of expertise? I think that makes a great opening question. It's just a little journalism criticism for all of you. I'm not a journalist critic, but whatever. I'm a critic of everybody. So equal opportunity. You all stink at what you do, and I'm just trying to help you out. All right, so I hope you enjoyed what we put together for you here today, and I hope it's not horribly out of date. I mean, I guess really if it was terribly out of date, then Sunday night was a real doozy. But it really looked like it was starting out that way, so there's just no telling. I'm going to be really antsy if I wake up and see horrific headlines and feel like I can't get on the air to talk about what was going on. But anyway, I'm sure I'm not so sure we'll survive one more day. But I'll be back to clean up the mess afterwards, regardless. Stay tuned now for Justice Putnam and the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy next.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.